Hey everybody, welcome to 3. 3 is a new series from the Crit House. In each episode, photographers will select 3 images from their archive, any images for any reasons, and share the stories behind them. The idea came from artist and photographer John Paul Kempernegro. His episode will be coming up soon. We are thrilled to kick things off today with Pete Souza. Pete Souza is one of the most acclaimed photojournalists of our time. Pete served as chief official White House photographer for Presidents Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, traveling with President Obama to all 50 states and more than 60 countries. His photographs have given the world an intimate look at leadership, history, and humanity at the highest levels of power. Pete's work has appeared in National Geographic, Time, and Life. His book, Obama, An Intimate Portrait, was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and he was the subject of the acclaimed documentary, The Way I See It. We are honored to launch 3 with Pete Souza. Pete Souza, welcome back to the Crit House. You joined us a while back to talk about your photographic influences for our My 5 series. Now we're going to talk about your work, and that's good work. You know, I have to say, when we had you on before, it was like one of our most popular episodes. People like Pete Souza.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have a lot of followers on Instagram, so that's probably part of it. I'm somewhat outspoken, so I think.
Well, I mean, you were also there at a critical point in history, and you've seen a lot of things through your work at the White House in a couple of different presidential circumstances. So, give me a thumbnail for those very few people who don't know who Pete Souza is. So, when you talk to people about you as a photographer, you're in an airport someplace, and they say, "What do you do?" What do you tell them?
Oh, I usually try to not tell them exactly what I do. I start out saying, "Oh, well, I worked for newspapers. I worked for the government for a while," and then, sometimes we get to the point of where they go, I know you from somewhere, and they basically they know me because of my stint as official White House photographer for President Obama. And I think that's what I'm best known for. But I also held this similar job for President Reagan. And I also was a photojournalist for many years, both at daily newspapers and as a freelancer. And so, I think I have a pretty varied career, but I think people mostly know me because of my photos of President Obama.
Coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, that path of your career are going to be some of the images we'll talk about. We're going to talk about something from early in your career, something from the Reagan administration, and something from the Obama administration as well. Let's take a look at the images. Let's start with number 1. Tell us about this image and why, of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I assume, of images you've taken, why this is one of the 3 images you've chosen to talk about here on the Crit House.
This was very early in my career when I was a graduate student at Kansas State University and was working for the Kansas State Collegian. I had started taking photography classes in my junior year at Boston University, and it took me several years to get competent in terms of the technical aspects of then analog black and white photography and learning how to capture moments, which I think I had become somewhat proficient at, but mostly covering events and sports, to be honest with you. I think I was probably inspired by looking at some old Life magazines. I had seen a photo essay on a one-room schoolhouse, and I just happened to be at the apartment I lived at in Manhattan, Kansas. Across the street was this old stone house, and it turned out to be a daycare center, which was a relatively new. I didn't know there was such a thing as a daycare center, but as I learned about it, I said, well, maybe I can do a photo story on this daycare center in much the same vein, like this photo essay I had seen on One Room Schoolhouse. And so I approached the people at the daycare center, and I ended up focusing on this one teacher who taught the toddler group, I think it was called. And basically, over the course of, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, I would just show up and hang out. And it really taught me how to be what I call invisibly present, where you're obviously there, people know you're there, but they get so used to you being around that it's like you're not there. And it was in that context that I was able to make these candid images that were, I felt, authentic, and it showed how life unfolded inside this daycare center. Now, this particular image, these two kids had just had a little fight, and the teacher, this woman, Liv Borson was her name, was trying to console the one who had kind of gotten beaten up and kind of, I guess, semi-scolding Brian, the little kid that you see in the background. And, so for me, this was like an intimate moment. It was real life. I thought I composed it pretty well. It's cropped a little bit to the edges were a little, didn't really add to the photos. I cropped it a little bit. The lighting's good. And more importantly, I have framed it pretty well so you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. And I've clicked the shutter at just the right time. And as I made the picture, there was something inside of me that knew I had clicked the shutter at just the right time. And, the reason I chose this picture is because this is what I've strived for my whole career. And it may sound kind of silly, but it's essentially what I did at the White House. Is I was always invisibly present and try and make authentic pictures and press the shutter at just the right time. So that's why I chose that photo.
Well, I love it. I love the image, and I love how you've talked about how it goes through your career. But just the thing you didn't mention is like just the gesture. I mean, which is the moment, right, where those hands are just there, and his face is so compelling, looking up at his teacher. I just love it.
And I think that and you'll see in the other two photos that I chose, gestures play an important part in my photography. I mean, it was somewhat coincidental in choosing these three pictures, but you're always waiting for sometimes a facial expression or a gesture or some kind of moment, and oftentimes that does involve a gesture, like Brian is pulling his face down. You can kind of see the tear starting to form.
So now, since you referenced your second image, number 2, let's go to that. And this image with Nancy Reagan, and immediately you see the gesture that you're speaking of as she's holding the hand of the gentleman by her side. Tell us about this image, Pete.
So I'd spent 5.5 years as official White House photographer, the last 5.5 years of the Reagan administration, and had always gotten along well with Nancy Reagan. I mean, she was, a tough person to deal with sometimes, but I think she respected what I did. So when her husband died in 2004, this is after I had left the White House. So, he left office in January 1989, and this is, I can't do the math, is it 15 years later? 2004, I'm asked to be the official photographer for the Reagan funeral, which was kind of like basically a 4-day event. I flew out to California, where his body lay in state at the Reagan Library. President Bush 43, sent Air Force One out to California to pick up Reagan's body. This is on the plane ride from California to D.C. And at some point during the flight, Mrs. Reagan, that's her son, Ron,
yep,
next to her, and that's Ron's wife, Doria. The three of them came back and knelt down, as you can see, in front of the casket. It's probably as intimate a situation as I've ever been in. I respect people's privacy, but at the same time, this is a very public funeral, although this is clearly a private moment. Even in these situations, I've always erred on the side of making the photograph. To me, this is history. And I felt I knew Nancy Reagan well enough that if she did not want me to be there, and this is just conjecture on my part, if she did not want me to be there, she would have looked up at me. And she did not do that. And I felt compelled to continue to photograph, obviously in a very quiet, invisibly present kind of way, not, using a flash, not using a motor drive, single frame. I think I probably shot this with a 50 millimeter lens. So, and then when she put her hand up to her face to kind of hold back her emotions, click, that to me, that was the photo.
It strikes me that when you talked about in the first image from Manhattan, Kansas, in the school, that your ability to be a wallflower or in there and to be invisible as much as possible is something that you carried with you here. Because I can't imagine being a photographer who has a big presence coming in and actually being able to capture this intimate moment.
Yeah, people, young students, often ask me, how do you do this? And it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think this is something that you relate to people on a, human to human level, and you put yourself in their place and act accordingly. I've got a knack for being able to do this. I mean, President Obama, in his first memoir, references this, that I forget the exact words he used, but essentially he didn't use the words invisibly present, but that's sort of like the best way, I think, is how to describe it. I mean, you've heard people say, oh, he's a fly on the wall, or, he's part of the wallpaper or whatever. No, I mean, I'm definitely, I'm definitely present. And you just have to find it within yourself on how to do this. And I've seemed to somehow figure out how to do that over my career, starting back, in that daycare center in 1978, I think it was.
It seems like, just without talking about the specifics of this image or past image, is that this is something I'm wrestling with as a human and as a photographer, is finding who you are so that you can capture the images in the circumstance that you are in. I mean, I clearly have not been in the White House taking photographs, and I'm not a photojournalist. I work on the street, and so I have to find a presence in that atmosphere to be able to capture the images I'm hoping to capture. And I assume, even though I'm not a portrait photographer, that it's the same thing. You have to find a presence that allows you to be able to interact and capture those images. And the first two you've shown are amazing in illustrating that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's many different types of photography, and I've chose the path of striving to put myself in the situations where I'm the only photographer there. I don't have an assistant. I don't have anybody holding a light for me. I don't necessarily like to be with reporters, on assignment. And so I think I'm best at being in these, relatively intimate situations and figuring out how to do my thing where there's no other distractions. The only distraction is myself and my camera, and how to figure out how to maneuver in those types of situations. I don't know if that.
All done very well. Your third image, I think, is a little different. I don't know the exact circumstance, but I'm assuming you weren't the only photographer here where President Obama and Vladimir Putin were interacting, but you captured this moment in history. Tell us about this.
I was the only photographer there.
Oh, you were? Okay, my mistake.
Yeah. I mean, I think I chose this photo, rather than the more noted ones, the picture of Jacob Philadelphia touching President Obama's head. People are kind of familiar with that one. The Situation Room photo during the bin Laden raid. I've kind of talked about those before. People are familiar with those. People may be familiar with this photograph, but to me, the backstory is important, which is this picture was taken in Normandy, France in 2013, not long after Russia invaded Crimea. President Obama was very, to use his mild word, pissed at Vladimir Putin. So, because of the anniversary of D-Day, there was a head of state luncheon in Normandy with many heads of state. Queen Elizabeth was there. Many of the NATO allies were there, heads of state, and Vladimir Putin was there. I knew that following this luncheon, that President Obama was going to, make a beeline to Putin and have a conversation with him. The French officials, let's say, they did not like me very much. They
how is that possible?
The access for the official White House photographer in other countries is often up to the host country. And so I had run-ins with the French for 5 years. It was like a ongoing amusement for President Obama to watch me almost get tackled by the French. So at this head of state luncheon, there was a moment, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, where the press is let in to the luncheon, and then every head of state has an official photographer. All the official photographers are let in, make a few pictures, and then we're kicked out of the room and kicked out of the house where this meeting took place. Now, this is where being a seasoned guy comes into play. So I always traveled very lightly, 2 cameras, maybe 1 extra lens. That was it. And so when I was getting kicked out of the house without the French noticing, I went and stayed with my Secret Service friends who were dressed just like me in a dark suit. And I hid my cameras and I conversed with them outside the luncheon room, and nobody paid me any attention. So that when the lunch broke up and Putin and Obama walk out and they're in the next room, boom, I suddenly emerge from where's my Secret Service friends, and I'm able to document this entire conversation. I mean, this is one of dozens and dozens and dozens of photos that I took. It's a pretty much a horizontal 3x2 format that when you look through that viewfinder, I'm pretty much a horizontal guy. And I think if you were to look at my pictures, which I don't actually have in front of me, but I probably started out horizontal and I probably kept moving back. And then I realized that the vertical format was the best way to go in this particular situation. And you can see it wasn't what I would call a clean background, or a lot of officials, Secret Service. You see the guy on the left side of the frame, talking into his microphone. I think Putin understands a little bit of English, but the guy standing right behind them is actually the interpreter, who's translating, word for word what Obama's saying to him. And then the gesture, the body language, the leaning over, the almost touching foreheads. I thought it was indicative of this conversation, what was taking place in the world at the time.
Yeah.
The casualness of Vladimir Putin, with his hand in his pocket at this very high-level discussion. It was a matter of, never once President Obama by then, of course, was used to me being around, but never once did Putin or any of the Russians, I don't even know if they noticed that I was there. Again, I was being fairly invisibly present, trying to capture moments. And I think it would have been more difficult to make this photograph if, for instance, the Russian official photographer had been next to me, or if the press pool had been next to me. For me, this is as authentic a photograph that can be made between these two gentlemen because of all those things that I said.
Yeah, I mean, it's all those things, and I now that you talk about it, I see the difference between this image and my assumption that it was in a gaggle or a press pool of folks around. That does make it different. And I will note, without going down a political rabbit hole, that just from a historical context, this image, it would be very different than the two people who are the leaders of these countries right now. That would be a different image in terms of their body language and their relationship and the way that those the current two people, Putin being one of them, relate to each other. So it's just an interesting dynamic from that sort of historical perspective, where we are now versus where we are then.
There was a picture after the last meeting between those two, Trump and Putin, backstage, where Trump is like pointing his finger in Putin's chest. He's actually touching his chest, and they both have smiles on their faces. It's the oddest photo, because I was sort of like, okay, I would love to know the circumstance of what they were talking about in that particular image. There's a famous photo of Nixon and Khrushchev by Elliot Erwitt, where Nixon is giving it to Khrushchev with his pointing his finger in his chest, and it's very the Trump Putin photo is very similar to that. So I'm like, I wonder if that was like they were like trying to recreate that photo or what. I don't know.
Well, I don't think Nixon and Khrushchev were smiling, if I recall.
They were not smiling. No.
It was not
Rick Smolin. Rick Smolin sent his Elliot was his father-in-law, sent me that picture, the Khrushchev Nixon picture, after the summit, and I said, "Have you seen the Trump Putin photo?" And he hadn't seen it, so I sent it to him. I think he was like, "Oh my gosh."
Well, again, I mean, it is one of the interesting things about your work is that it puts it in a historical perspective. I mean, this photograph with Obama and Putin says something about the men and the time and the circumstance versus the Nixon Khrushchev versus the Trump Putin image. Pete Souza, a pleasure to have you on the Crit House once again. Thank you so much for joining us.
You bet. Thank you, Jeff.
All right. And thank you all for watching the Crit House.